Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the next chapter in our series of aquaculture-related webinars designed to bring together science and business to expand and strengthen the United States aquaculture industry. These webinars are a joint effort between the National Aquaculture Association, the North Central Regional Aquaculture Center, and the United States Aquaculture Society. Whether you're currently engaged in aquaculture, looking to get into business, or an educator helping others understand aquaculture, or if you just want to become a better educated consumer, we hope that these webinars will enhance your knowledge and move you forward on your journey to success. Today's webinar is the second part of a two-part series presented by the United States Department of Agriculture's Food Safety and Inspection Service, or FSIS. This webinar will help us understand the new rules associated with the labeling of fish of the order Siluriformes and the products derived from them. The webinar will be presented by Dr. Beth McHugh, an experienced public health veterinarian who helped launch and run the FSIS Small Plant Help Desk, which provides regulatory assistance to small processing plant owners and operators. Beth will cover the labeling features required by USDA FSIS for these products and the label submission process. We thank Beth and all the FSIS team for taking time from their busy schedule to work with us today. I'm sure that after Beth is finished, we'll have a better understanding of the labeling requirement and what we need to do to comply. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Beth, and thanks again for all your help on this topic.
Okay, good morning, or good afternoon, actually. I'm Dr. Beth McHugh with the FSIS Labeling and Program Delivery staff in the Office of Policy and Program Development. And today, we're going to talk about labels. During today's webinar, I'll be discussing the required features on domestic labels for Siluriformes fish and fish products, including catfish, the different types of FSIS label approval, which types of labels must be submitted to the labeling staff for approval, as well as which labels do not have to be submitted to us for review. We will also discuss how to submit a label to FSIS for approval. And finally, we will briefly cover FSIS's policy on pressure-sensitive stickers and the requirements of a labeling record. That's a lot of information to cover, so let's go ahead and get started. Now that Siluriformes fish and fish products are no longer under the jurisdiction of the FDA, now falling under the jurisdiction of FSIS, I'd like to begin by highlighting some key differences between FDA and FSIS requirements for labeling. The FDA does not require prior label approval. FSIS requires prior label approval for all labels before the products may be marketed. I'll go into detail about FSIS's prior label approval later in the presentation. The FDA does not require a market inspection, while FSIS requires that all inspected and passed products bear an inspection legend. On a slightly different note, the FDA approves the safety of food ingredients, and these ingredients could appear on the labels of products FSIS regulates. Immediate containers for products packaged and labeled domestically will have up to 9 required label features. In some cases, the regulations specify exactly where the required features must be located. For example, some features must appear on the principal display panel, while other features are not required to appear on this panel. Before I begin talking about the specific label features and where they must be located, it's important to explain what I'm talking about when I reference the different panels. Now, the good news is that the principal display panel and the information panel are defined by FSIS in the same manner in which they're defined by the FDA. The principal display panel, commonly referred to as the PDP, is the part of the label most likely to be displayed when offered for sale under customary conditions. The information panel, or IP, is typically located to the right of the PDP. The specifics for where the information panel is located on a container are outlined in 9 CFR, that's the Code of Federal Regulations, so 9 CFR 317.2M, and that regulation was noted on the previous slide. This slide highlights FSIS's labeling requirements that are new to Siluriformes fish and fish products and that must appear on the principal display panel. The name of the product and the net quantity of contents, or net weight, must be displayed on the PDP. Note that both of these features were also required when Siluriformes fish and fish products were under the jurisdiction of the FDA. Number 3 on this list is required for product imported into the US only and wouldn't apply to domestically packaged and labeled product. Therefore, we won't be discussing this feature today. Number 4 on the list of required features is the official inspection legend, which we'll discuss in a moment. And in addition, if a product is perishable and needs special handling to maintain its wholesomeness, a handling statement must also appear on the principal display panel. And the next few slides will provide additional information about some of these features. Regarding the product name, Catfish may only appear as a product name on products that contain fish from the family Ictaluridae. This requirement was in place when Siluriformes fish and fish products were under the jurisdiction of the FDA, and FSIS adopted a similar regulation. All other Siluriformes fish and fish products must be labeled with their common or usual name. In the final rule, we stated that establishments should refer to the FDA seafood list for acceptable common or usual names. FSIS requires that raw meat and poultry products, and that includes Siluriformes, that contain added solution must bear a descriptive designation as part of the product name. An example of an added solution descriptive designator would be contains 10% added solution of water, salt, and sodium phosphate. And there's some flexibility with the wording of the solution statement, and that contains is not the only word you may use. For example, we see marinated, brined, tumbled, basted, used as part of the added solution statement. However, the regulations specifically prohibit the use of the word enhanced as part of the descriptive designation. We do have very prescriptive requirements about the added solution statement fonts, the font style and size and the color, all of that in relation to the product name. So if you're adding solution to raw fish products, I encourage you to review 9 CFR 317.2E2 for the specific requirements. You'll see on this slide that the USDA inspection legend applied domestically is the same legend applied to other meat products, such as pork and beef. We receive a lot of questions about the legend. What size must it be? Where on the label must it be located? Well, there's no specific size requirement. The legend must be conspicuous and legible, and it must be located on the principal display panel. But it may be located anywhere on the principal display panel. It does need to have a uniform colored background. We do see labels come in where the legend is placed on top of a photograph or a graphic, or placed on top of an area on the label where there's a color transition, or on a multicolor background. In these cases, the background is no longer a single color, and that is not permitted. I want to clarify that the USDA inspection legend shown on this slide is applied by establishments operating under a grant of inspection issued by FSIS. Product produced in another country would not bear the USDA legend upon being imported into the US. Product imported into the US bears the plant number assigned by the foreign country and the foreign inspection legend. A handling statement must appear on the principal display panel for all perishable products that need special handling to maintain their wholesomeness. Examples of handling statements include keep refrigerated and keep frozen. There will likely be a handling statement on most fish and fish product labels, such as frozen fillets or breaded products. Examples of products that don't need the handling statement would be products like a dried product that's shelf stable or thermally processed or canned product. The remaining labeling features listed on this slide, the name and place of business, an ingredient statement if composed of more than one ingredient, and nutrition labeling, also called the nutrition facts panel. These features may appear on the principal display panel or on the information panel. In addition, one feature, the safe handling instructions, may appear on any panel. And note that the safe handling instructions are the only feature on this slide that's unique to FSIS. As I mentioned, the safe handling instructions may appear on any panel of the immediate container. The instructions are only required on products that are not ready to eat, in other words, raw, and that will be sold directly to consumers, hotels, restaurants, and other similar institutions. The safe handling instructions are very prescriptive in both the language that must be used and in the graphics that appear in the image. The border that you see here around the text is required, and there's even a requirement that only 2 colors may be used, a single color font and a single color background. The phrase in the safe handling instructions, meat and or poultry, must be changed to fish in 3 different locations, and that is a regulatory requirement. This quick reference chart lists all of the required labeling features. There's no new information on this chart. It simply displays what we've already discussed today in the form of a table. As I stated at the beginning of this presentation, FSIS requires prior label approval for all labels before the products may be marketed. Prior approval is granted by FSIS in one of 2 ways. as a sketch approval that must be submitted to the FSIS labeling and program delivery staff, or as a generic approval. Certain labels may be generically approved when they're in full compliance with any applicable labeling regulations. Labels that are generically approved do not have to be submitted to the labeling staff for review and approval. And I'll say that one more time. Labels that may be generically approved do not have to be submitted to the labeling staff for review. So the next slide is going to explain the difference between these two types of label approval, sketch approval and generic approval, in greater detail. FSIS regulations specify 4 categories of labels which must be submitted to the labeling and program delivery staff for review. We only have 3 categories listed on this slide because one of the categories only applies to certain poultry products and is therefore not relevant to Siluriformes fish and fish products. The types of fish labels that must be submitted to FSIS for sketch approval are labels that need a temporary approval. For example, because the product formula has changed and now the ingredients listed on the label are not in the correct order of predominance. Labels for products for export out of the United States with certain labeling deviations. Or, and this is the most likely type of label that you'd be submitting to the labeling staff for review, labels with special statements or claims. For example, all natural, or animal-raising claims such as no antibiotics administered. Also, negative claims like gluten-free or no preservatives are considered special statements or claims, and therefore, when stated on a label, the label must be submitted to the labeling staff for approval. Now, additional guidance on what qualifies as a special statement or claim is available on FSIS's website shown on this slide. All other labels that do not fall into any of the categories listed on this slide do not require submission to FSIS. Therefore, they're eligible for generic approval, meaning that they do not have to be submitted to the labeling staff as part of a formal review process. By September 1, 2017, there must be an approval on file for all Siluriformes fish and fish product labels. We'll talk in a minute about what's required to be included in a labeling record, even for labels that are generically approved. But remember, those labels with special statements and claims must be submitted to the labeling and program delivery staff for approval, and you'll have to have that approval on file by September 1st, 2017. And FSIS is encouraging establishments to submit any label that requires sketch approval to submit that as soon as possible. And you might be wondering, how do you go about submitting a label to the labeling staff for sketch approval? Label applications may be submitted in one of 2 ways. Electronically, using FSIS's online label submission and approval system, referred to informally as LSAS, or by sending in a paper application by mail, courier, or using a consultant. And note that FSIS will not accept label approval applications by fax or email. Now, to access FSIS's electronic label approval system, the applicant must first receive Level 2 E-Authentication. This is required for people conducting certain electronic business with the U.S. Department of Agriculture. This is a 2-part process which involves registering for E-Authentication credentials and then involves a follow-up visit to a USDA service center. And this slide shows the websites and contact information for that process, which is managed by the Department of Agriculture. Now, once you have your E-Authentication credentials, you can sign up for access to LSAS and begin the online label submission process. And there are many, many benefits of electronic label submission. FSIS receives your label instantly. Well, of course, mailing a document to our office will take at least a couple of days. In addition, with LSAS, you'll receive instant confirmation that the label's been received, as the status of your application will be marked online as received. LSAS will also send you an email when your application's been opened by a label reviewer, and then once the label's reviewed, you'll receive an email that the label has been approved or returned back to you because of additional information is needed or modifications are required before approval can be granted. As I mentioned earlier, FSIS will continue to accept paper label applications by mail. When submitting by paper, the applicant must complete FSIS Form 7234-1. A blank form is available at the web address provided on this slide. And this slide shows a snapshot of the first page of the application. The application is actually 3 pages. Applicants sometimes overlook the product formula and processing procedures pages of the form. So I just wanted to remind you that the application is 3 pages long. And when completing the form, we ask that you check the meat box for fish and fish products as shown. That's in box 4A. Also, when submitting by paper, the applicant must submit 2 copies of the completed application and 2 copies of the label. And remember, this is a 3-page application, and that's not counting any additional documentation you send in with the label. So for additional information on how to complete FSIS Form 7234-1, you can visit the web address on this slide. Now, I've already mentioned that electronic label submission is much faster than paper. If you aren't already convinced of the advantage of electronic submission over paper, I have another reason for you to go out and get your E-Authentication credentials so you can start using LSAS to submit your labels electronically. FSIS is now scanning all paper label applications into our electronic label approval system. So when label reviewers like me are reviewing labels, we're doing so through LSAS only. So the process of receiving paper labels in our office and actually scanning them into LSAS does delay the time it takes to review a paper label application. Whereas, as I mentioned earlier, when a label is submitted electronically, it's instantly in line awaiting review as soon as you hit the save button. For this reason, applicants are strongly encouraged to submit label applications electronically through LSAS. As we wind down the presentation for today, I do want to mention FSIS's policy on pressure-sensitive stickers. Use of stickers applied to labels may serve as an alternative to reprinting. For example, if a label is missing a required feature or contains inaccurate information. And what we mean by pressure-sensitive is that the sticker must destroy the underlying label or package if removed. There's no formal approval required to apply a sticker unless that sticker is adding a special statement or claim. So for example, if you're covering up an ingredient that's no longer in the product or changing an address on the label, that would not require submission to labeling staff for review. However, adding a claim such as gluten-free requires approval by the labeling staff. Therefore, application of a sticker bearing the claim gluten-free or bearing any special statement or claim would require approval by the labeling staff. FSIS also requires that certain labeling records be on file. This is for labels that go through the formal sketch approval process by the labeling staff and labels that are not sent to us for review, and those are approved generically. So all labeling records must include a copy of the final label applied to the product formulation, the processing procedures, and supporting documentation for statements and claims on the label, which in some instances would include a copy of the sketch approval from the labeling staff. So some examples of support you might have as part of your label record would be support for the statement certified gluten-free, or documentation supporting a claim of fish never administered antibiotics. And after September 1st, 2017, labeling records must be presented to FSIS inspection personnel upon request. So you heard last week, actually I guess it would be yesterday, that from now through September 1st, 2017, Siluriformes fish and fish products are in what FSIS is calling a transitional period. During this time, FSIS will be using discretion in the enforcement of certain labeling regulations. There are, however, labeling deficiencies that will warrant enforcement action during the transitional period from now through September 1st, 2017. And those deficiencies are if there's no label on the product, if one of the big 8 allergens is present in the product but is not declared on the label, if the product is labeled as catfish but does not contain fish from the family Ictaluridae, or if the net weight is intentionally overdeclared. For all other labeling deficiencies, FSIS will work with establishments to bring their labels into compliance with FSIS requirements by the end of the transition period. So this concludes the formal portion of my presentation for today. Now I'll be turning the presentation over to Bucky Gwartney for his presentation.
Hello, my name is Bucky Gwartney. I'm an international marketing specialist at the USDA Ag Marketing Service. I'm in the LPS program's Quality Assessment Division. This division does our auditing function, our grading function, and also our standards function. I'm going to briefly talk about what AMS is doing on the catfish grading and grade standards project and highlight a few of the examples of what our program does on grade standards and the grading process. As you know, the recent Farm Bill directed USDA to establish a grading program for catfish, and you just heard about the inspection side of that. It's important to know, though, and to remember that this grading service that we are developing is a voluntary fee-for-service program. Currently, the Department of Commerce and the National Marine Fisheries provide the current grade standard for catfish, and they have a published catfish standard. However, that service is being transitioned to the USDA Ag Marketing Service. Our authority to do grade standards and grading goes back to the 1946 Ag Marketing Act, which authorizes the Secretary of Ag to develop and improve standards of quality, condition, quantity, grade, and packaging, and recommend and demonstrate such standards in order to encourage uniformity and consistency in commercial practices. Obviously, we've been doing grading for quite some time, and we're committed to carrying out this authority in a manner that facilitates the marketing of ag products. Certainly, catfish will be no different. This particular slide is just an example of an outline on what our grading program would look like and how we ensure that the grading function and the standards are implemented in the field. They're going to have very specific instructions and outlines on how to do things. They'll have issues that are outlined that people can access, but it's mostly for the actual field grader who's doing the work. I also wanted to show you an example of some of our grading activities, and you may recognize many of these as having a high marketplace recognition. For example, our beef grading program, which does our USDA Prime, Choice, and Select for fed beef. We have several process verified programs, for instance, for poultry. Maybe they have specific marketing claims that are part of that process verification. And of course, you're probably all familiar with the USDA organic program that USDA does also. So these are just examples of how product can be differentiated and certainly have a consumer recognition. Moving forward with this effort, here's just an example of a timeline that we're working on right now. We have basically developed a federal registered notice, and that's waiting for approval, and it's going to be seeking comment on developing a United States standard for grades of catfish and catfish products. That has not been published yet, but we hope it's imminent. We are proposing that this will be a 60-day comment period. As with all of our grade standards, development or changing of grade standards, we really want a significant input from stakeholders, and we encourage that. We want to obviously implement and have a standard that's workable and usable by the industry. We're also currently working on planning and facilitating a couple of basically catfish quality and industry related workshops. We have not finalized the location and date of those, but they would be more probably mid to late summer activities and somewhere down in the Delta region. With that, I'll end my presentation, and if you have any questions, certainly we can address those as well. Thank you.
So the first question in my queue that I'm seeing is, does a package of catfish need to state that it contains fish as an allergen concern? So an allergen statement, contains soy, contains fish. That's not an FSIS requirement. So we don't have a requirement that it says contains fish. In this case, since catfish is, essentially an allergen, I guess. The label would say that as part of the product name, because it does need to bear a product name. But there doesn't need to be, there's no requirement that there's a separate statement contains fish. Just as if the product, was marinated in soy sauce, it wouldn't need to say contains soy. In that case, the ingredient would be listed in the ingredient statement. And in my queue, the next question I see is, if the label doesn't require country of origin for U.S. products, how does this affect the cool requirements? So just to clarify, when I said imported domestic product does not require a country of origin statement, what I was referring to is FSIS has a specific requirement. If you want to get nerdy here, it's 9 CFR 327.14b is the import requirement. There's a fish requirement that references that. So that requirement says that any product imported into the U.S. needs to bear a statement, country of X, actually product of X, so product of Canada, for example, immediately under the product name. That requirement is FSIS's specific requirement for imported products. AMS, there's a program people commonly refer to as COOL. You see it commonly written with all capital letters. That's an AMS program. We do require that the label complies with AMS requirements, but the specific requirements, this is for products at retail and there's certain covered commodities. Those requirements are AMS's requirement. That's the Ag Marketing Service, and they're another USDA agency. Those requirements are still in play. Those requirements are verified by AMS and not necessarily by FSIS.
So I think there's a question on, can imported fish make a special claim like antibiotics never administered? From AMS perspective, and any verification activity or certification service, certainly that could apply to other commodities. So I don't see why and other commodities from other countries. We have certainly programs in international countries, so I wouldn't see why that could not be done. So I believe the answer is yes, they could do that. We're obviously still working through some details with the grading program, but I believe that is okay. And then, Beth, you want to add something?
No, I'm sorry. No, your answer on the antibiotics is fine. We do see those claims here in the labeling office, and they can be made by imported product as well, as long as there's support and they need to be sent in for approval.
Right. And then, yes, we've been told by our administration this week that it's imminent that Federal Register notice will be published very soon. So absolutely within this month, barring some unforeseen circumstance. But yes, that should be published.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. In addition to the webinar link, we will also be putting a link to the FSIS back page. Have a good afternoon.